The Great Pyramid aligns with the North Star using nothing but rope and shadows. This video explores the minds of the ancient surveyors who made it possible. You will gain a completely new way of seeing history, not as random ruins, but as the direct result of deliberate, brilliant planning. How did thinkers without computers map cities to the stars? Why did they bury complex mathematics in the very layout of their streets? We are about to enter the minds of history's silent architects. What invisible lines from the ancient world do you still follow every single day? Their measurements were a language, one that spoke of a universe governed by perfect, invisible laws. To understand the surveyor, you must first understand the world they believed they were living in. For them, the sky was not empty space. It was a grand, rotating mechanism of stars and planets, each moving on divine schedules. The Earth, in turn, was seen as a static, receptive counterpart to that celestial motion. The fundamental job of the ancient surveyor, then, was to make these two realms resonate. They aimed to create a kind of sacred echo, where a temple on the ground would reflect the path of a star, or a city's main avenue would point toward the rising sun on the most important day of the year. This was not superstition. It was a sophisticated model of reality, where harmony between heaven and earth was believed to ensure stability, good harvests, and the favor of the gods. So when an Egyptian priest-surveyor lined up the foundation of a pyramid with the North Star, he was not just checking a box for architectural accuracy. He was physically tethering the monument, and by extension the kingdom, to the unchanging axis of the cosmos. He was building a permanent anchor in a turning sky. This philosophy meant that error was not merely a technical failure. A misaligned wall or an off-center plaza was a tear in the fabric of cosmic order. It risked introducing chaos into the community. Therefore, the precision we marvel at today was driven by a spiritual imperative. The surveyor's tools became instruments of devotion, and his meticulous calculations were a form of ritual observance. This mindset appears across the ancient world. In China, the concept of feng shui, which translates to wind and water, guided the placement of cities and tombs. It was based on reading the landscape to channel positive energy, or kai, aligning human structures with the natural flow of the Earth's own forces. The surveyor there was a reader of an invisible topography, mapping currents of energy just as carefully as physical rivers and mountains. In Mesoamerica, the grand plazas and pyramids of cultures like the Maya were often oriented to astronomical events, like the sun's position on the equinoxes. The layout was a calendar written in stone and space, designed to keep human time in sync with celestial time. So before we examine the knotted ropes, the sighting poles, or the water levels, we must sit with this idea. These individuals were not just early engineers, they were intermediaries. They stood between the chaos of the raw, unmeasured earth and the perfect geometry of the heavens. Their first tool was not made of wood or bronze. It was a philosophy, a conviction that the universe was orderly, knowable, and that humanity had a sacred duty to reflect that order in every stone they laid. This profound purpose is what elevated their work from simple construction to something that would shape civilizations for millennia. With this sacred charge as their compass, how did they then begin to translate grand cosmic ideas into tangible lines on the ground? The answer lies in a deceptively simple starting point, one every child understands, yet one that formed the bedrock of their world. They began by choosing a direction. Choosing a direction sounds simple, but for them, it was a monumental act of creation. It meant deciding where true north lay in a world without satellites, where the sun's path shifted with the seasons, and where the stars wheeled overhead in a nightly dance. To solve this, they became masters of patient observation. They would track the slow arc of a single star, noting the exact points on the horizon where it rose and set over many nights. They would drive stakes into the ground and watch the shifting shadows cast by the sun, marking the longest and shortest days of the year. From this raw data of light and shadow, they would slowly, painstakingly, tease out the invisible cardinal lines, the east-west axis, the north-south meridian. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as the ultimate testament to this celestial anchoring. Its sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an error of less than 1/15th of a degree. To achieve this, its builders likely used the circumpolar stars, those that never set, rotating around the true north celestial pole. By bisecting the angle between the rise and set positions of a single star over the course of a night, they could find north with astonishing precision. This was not a one-time trick. It was a repeatable geometric method born from deep, sustained watching of the sky. Across the ocean, the Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures performed a similar feat, but with different celestial guides. The Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza, with its narrow windows, is famously aligned to the extreme rising and setting points of Venus. This planet, seen as a god of war and rain, dictated the timing of ceremonies and even military campaigns. By orienting their architecture to its cycle, the surveyors wove the rhythm of a powerful deity directly into the stone fabric of their city. This practice of celestial anchoring served a profound purpose beyond mere orientation. It was about creating stability. The human world is one of change, of seasons, of generations rising and passing. But the cosmos above appeared eternal, predictable, governed by perfect mathematics. By physically tying a temple's cornerstone to the path of a star, the surveyor was borrowing that eternity. He was declaring that this building and the order it represented would endure as surely as the heavens themselves. It granted the construction divine sanction, making it a rightful part of the universal order. Every street laid out from that temple, every plaza measured from its walls, inherited that authority. The entire city became a microcosm, a small-scale model of the cosmos, with its own center, its own axes mirroring the celestial ones. The surveyor's first line in the dirt was therefore a line of faith, a belief that the language of the universe was geometry, and that humanity could learn to speak it. But that celestial order, once established on the ground, began to serve a second master. The perfect lines drawn from the stars soon became the blueprint for a new kind of power, one that was distinctly human. Geometry became the language of authority, and the surveyor its most fluent speaker. A straight line, after all, is the shortest distance between 2 points, but in the hands of an empire, it becomes the most efficient path for control. Look at the relentless, uniform grid of a Roman military camp, a castrum. This was not an organic settlement that grew over time. It was a perfect rectangle, stamped onto any landscape, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Syria. Within hours of arriving, Roman military surveyors, the agrimensors, would lay out the same template. They would mark the 2 main streets, the Cardo running north-south and the Decumanus running east-west, intersecting at the headquarters. Every tent, every workshop, every latrine had its predetermined place. This geometric imposition served a brutally practical purpose. It made the camp and the thousands of men within it instantly legible. A commander could stand at the center and understand the entire system at a glance. Order could be maintained, troops mobilized, and chaos suppressed with mechanical efficiency. The grid was a tool for turning a collection of individuals into a single, manageable unit. This principle scaled up from the military camp to the imperial city. When the Romans founded a new colony, they repeated the ritual. They would plow a sacred furrow to mark the city's boundary, then overlay the same rigid grid. The message was unambiguous. Roman law, Roman order, and Roman identity were now physically embedded into the earth itself. the citizen walking those straight streets was constantly reminded of the system that governed every aspect of life. The wide, central avenues led directly to the Forum, the seat of political and judicial power. There was no wandering, no getting lost in a maze of alleys. The architecture of the city guided you both physically and psychologically toward the center of authority. This was not unique to Rome. In ancient China, the ideal city plan, as described in the Rites of Zhu, was a perfect square oriented to the cardinal directions with symmetrical gates and walls. The imperial palace sat at the exact center, the literal and symbolic heart of the kingdom. The major avenues radiated out from it like spokes on a wheel, creating a hierarchical map where proximity to the center equated to power and status. The surveyors who laid out Chang'an or Beijing were not just plotting streets. They were engraving the Confucian social order into the landscape, making the philosophy of centralized, harmonious rule visible and tangible. For the average person living in such a city, this geometry was a daily teacher. The long, unbroken vista down a main axis, ending at the towering gates of a palace or temple, visually reinforced the chain of command. It created a sense of awe and subordination. Your place in society was mirrored by your place in the city's plan. The farther you lived from the central axis, the more peripheral you were to the workings of power. This was psychological architecture, where the very act of moving through your own hometown reinforced your role within a vast, impersonal system. The surveyor, in these contexts, transitioned from a priest of the cosmos to an agent of the state. His tools, the groma for sighting right angles, the chorobates for leveling, became instruments of administration. His meticulous measurements translated political will into spatial reality. He was the one who turned a king's decree for a new capital into a geometric fact on the ground, a fact that would dictate the flow of traffic, commerce, and thought for centuries. This geometry of control reveals a profound duality in the ancient surveyor's mind. He sought harmony with the cosmos, yet he also engineered hierarchy among men. He mapped the democratic stars, then used that same precision to build profoundly undemocratic cities. His lines could both connect humanity to the divine and firmly remind humanity of its place. But if straight lines were tools of control, what happened when the land itself fought back? When the sacred geometry met an unyielding mountain, a winding river, or the stubborn curve of the earth? This is where the story truly becomes fascinating. Yet the straight lines of imperial power met their match in a far more ancient and unruly force. Water does not follow right angles. It carves its own path, obeying gravity and the lay of the land. For civilizations built on the banks of great rivers, the surveyor's primary task was not to impose geometry, but to interpret a liquid logic. Their minds became hydrological, trained to read the subtle language of currents, silt, and seasonal floods. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, survival depended on one simple, brutal equation. Too little water meant famine, too much meant annihilation. The surveyors of Sumer and Akkad were the masters of this balance. Their most vital lines were not marked in stone, but dug into the earth as canals and embankments. Using nothing more than sighting poles and leveled strings, they orchestrated the flow of water across vast, flat plains, transforming unpredictable marsh and desert into the Fertile Crescent. This was a science of distribution and defense. A canal had to have just the right gradient, a gentle, consistent slope over miles to keep water moving without eroding its own banks. Calculating this without modern instruments was a feat of collective genius, refined over generations. A miscalculation of a single hand's breadth in elevation over a long distance could mean a canal that ran dry or one that burst its banks, drowning the fields it was meant to feed. The surveyor's measurement here was quite literally a matter of life and death for an entire city. This intimate dance with water shaped more than agriculture. it shaped the very concept of land ownership and social order. When the annual flood of the Nile receded in Egypt, it wiped away the boundary markers between fields. Priestly surveyors, using knotted ropes and geometric principles, would restore these lines. This ritual, repeated every year, was a sacred duty. It prevented conflicts, reaffirmed the pharaoh's role as the guarantor of order, and ensured the equitable distribution of the life-giving silt. The surveyor was the keeper of fairness, his tools the instruments of a social contract written in mud and water. In China, the philosophy of Feng Shui formalized this hydrological wisdom into a complete system for placing human settlements. A good site was not just about a view, it was about position relative to water. An ideal location, often described as a chair, would be backed by hills for protection, with a winding river flowing gently in front. The curve of the water was crucial. A sharp bend might create turbulent, damaging energy, while a gentle meander would pool nourishing Qi, the vital life force. The surveyor, acting as a Feng Shui master, was reading the landscape as a living body, with water as its blood. He sought the point where the community could tap into that vitality without being vulnerable to its fury. This deep understanding created the first large-scale, coordinated landscapes. The sprawling network of canals, terraces, and reservoirs from ancient Peru to Sri Lanka are testaments to the surveyor's role as a systems thinker. He wasn't just plotting a single farm or temple. He was designing an entire watershed, thinking in terms of catchment areas, seasonal flow, and long-term sustainability. His lines connected highland springs to lowland rice paddies, creating interdependent chains of communities all linked by the shared management of water. So the straight, authoritative lines of the city grid existed alongside, and often because of these organic, life-giving lines of hydraulic engineering. The surveyor had to hold both mindsets at once. He was a mathematician of celestial angles and a poet of river bends. He knew that to build a wall that would last, you first had to dig a ditch that would drain. This reveals their ultimate pragmatism. Their grand cosmic visions and imperial blueprints were always grounded in the most immediate human need, the need for a reliable drink, a fruitful harvest, a home safe from the flood. And if their work with water and stone was so precise, so enduring, it forces a haunting question about the knowledge they possessed. What other secrets of measurement and meaning did they encode into the world that we have simply forgotten how to see? Perhaps their greatest tool was not an object at all, but a profound intimacy with the natural world. The Polynesian navigators, who settled islands across an ocean wider than continents, performed a kind of fluid surveying without maps or compasses. They read the subtle patterns of swells refracting around distant, unseen islands. They memorized the star paths that arched over specific atolls. They watched the flight of birds at dusk, knowing certain species would always fly toward land. Their canoe was their survey vessel, and the entire Pacific Ocean their chart. This was surveying as a living dialogue with the environment, where the tools were human senses, honed by generations of observation into an exact science. It proves a powerful idea. Technological sophistication is not always about complexity. It is about perfect, elegant adaptation. A Roman engineer with his groma and a Polynesian wayfinder reading the waves were both solving the same core problem: how to impose human intention upon a vast and indifferent world. They simply listened to different teachers. One listened to the geometry of the land, the other to the rhythm of the sea. Yet both methods worked with breathtaking precision because they emerged from a deep, patient understanding of the rules their particular world followed. This raises a final, haunting possibility. If their tools and techniques were so effective, born from such careful observation, what profound truths about the Earth itself might they have uncovered? Truths that we, with all our satellites, are only now beginning to recognize. The most sophisticated instrument they possessed could not be held in the hand. it was the human mind itself. In a world without reference books or universal education, the master surveyor carried his entire science within his memory. He was a living library of star paths, a walking repository of geometric theorems, a human database of hydrological patterns. This knowledge was not written down for anyone to find. It was a closely guarded craft passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, through years of silent observation and hands-on practice. The apprentice did not learn from a manual. He learned by holding the sighting pole exactly where his master told him, by feeling the tension in the knotted rope, by memorizing the stories of past floods and failed alignments. The training was a slow encoding of instinct, where the rules of the cosmos and the earth became as natural as breathing. This culture of secrecy served a clear purpose. In a society where specialized knowledge was power, the surveyor's skills were a form of high-value currency. A guild that could guarantee a straight aqueduct or a perfectly oriented temple held immense social and political influence. To share their methods openly would dilute that authority, so they developed their own jargon, their own symbolic shorthand, and their own oral traditions that were meaningless to an outsider. The precise method for finding true north using 2 stars, the exact ratio for a canal's slope over soft soil, the secret chant for remembering the 60-year celestial cycle, these were treasures protected as fiercely as any royal tomb. This reliance on memory and mentorship demanded a different kind of intelligence. A master had to visualize an entire city's grid from a single baseline. He had to hold in his mind the complex relationship between a foundation trench on the ground and a constellation's position months in the future. His spatial reasoning was a kind of internal, 3-dimensional cartography. He could walk a bare field and see, in his mind's eye, the future colonnades, the flowing fountains, the shadows cast by towers not yet built. This mental model was then transmitted to his team through metaphor, story, and repetitive demonstration. He might say, align this wall with the mountain notch where the sun rests on the longest day, or dig this trench as deep as a man is tall, and with the same gentle slope as a resting palm frond. The instructions were poetic, precise, and utterly dependent on shared experience. This system created an unbroken chain of human wisdom, a direct line of thought stretching back generations. But it also made that wisdom heartbreakingly fragile. The death of a master without a fully prepared successor could mean the loss of techniques refined over centuries. A social upheaval, a war, a natural disaster that scattered a guild could erase entire schools of knowledge. We see this shadow in the historical record, in the abandoned cities where the water system fell into disrepair not from conquest, but from a forgotten understanding of its maintenance. The meticulously laid canal without its living curator would eventually silt up. The perfect astronomical alignment without the priest who knew how to verify it would drift into mere superstition. This highlights the profoundly human dimension of their achievement. The pyramids and aqueducts we marvel at today are not just monuments of stone, they are the crystallized memory of individuals. They are the final, physical form of a thought that once lived in one person's mind, was passed in whispers to another, and was finally translated into geometry on the earth. The true blueprint was not on papyrus. It was in the careful habits of thought, the disciplined gaze, and the steadfast mentorship that kept the flame of understanding alive. This fragile chain of learning raises a final, compelling mystery. If so much depended on the individual, what traces of their personal perspective, their unique way of seeing, might still be hidden within the grand structures they left behind? The silent stone of Teotihuacan holds a conversation with the sky. Walk its immense central avenue today, and you are tracing a line drawn by ancient minds who saw the universe as a story written in light. The city's main axis, the Avenue of the Dead, does not point to our geographic north. Instead, it veers 15.5 degrees to the east, a deliberate and puzzling offset. For decades, this orientation seemed like an error, a quirk of the landscape, but the truth is far more profound. That precise angle aligns perfectly with the point on the horizon where the Pleiades star cluster would have set around the year 100, on the day the sun passed directly overhead. In the Mesoamerican world, this event marked the beginning of the rainy season, a moment of vital renewal. The surveyors did not just point a road toward a pretty group of stars. They anchored their entire city to a celestial herald of life itself. This alignment was not achieved with a glance upward. It was a feat of terrestrial engineering using the immutable features of the landscape as a guide. The surrounding mountain peaks served as their permanent sighting posts. By choosing a distant notch between two volcanoes as their visual target, the master planners created a reference line that would never shift, a foundation more reliable than any man-made marker. From this primary axis, everything else unfolded. The colossal pyramid of the sun was positioned so that its western facade would catch the last light of the setting sun on the day it passed directly overhead, bathing the structure in a dramatic, perpendicular shadow. The Pyramid of the Moon at the avenue's northern terminus frames the sacred Cerro Gordo mountain behind it, visually tying the built environment to the powerful earth. Every major structure in Teotihuacan participates in this cosmic choreography. The Ciudadela complex and the Temple of Quetzalcoatl are positioned to mark the sun's position on the equinoxes. Walking the city at these precise times, one would witness shadows and alignments that transform architecture into a giant, interactive sundial. The city was not merely built under the sky, it was designed as an instrument to measure it, a permanent interface between the community and the cycles that governed their survival. The surveyors here were astronomer priests, and their blueprint was a calendar written in stone and space. They embedded an entire philosophy of time, a belief in cyclical renewal and celestial order, directly into the pavement beneath every citizen's feet. This transforms our understanding of the place. A resident of Teotihuacan did not need a handheld almanac. The city itself told them the time of year. The play of light along the Avenue of the Dead, the silhouette of a pyramid against a specific star, these were public, communal reminders of their place within a vast, orderly cosmos. The surveyor's work guaranteed that every sunrise, every sunset, every rising of the Pleiades would reconfirm the sacred contract between the people and the powers they believed guided their world. It was a masterpiece of what we might now call immersive design, where the environment itself was the teacher and the ritual. But if a city could be a clock, what other profound calculations, what other layers of meaning might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to learn their language? The celestial harmony of Teotihuacan stands in stark contrast to the sound of a wooden stake being hammered into foreign soil. The Roman surveyor, the agrimensor, arrived not with star charts but with a mandate. His task was not to reflect the cosmos but to impose an empire. His primary tool was the groma, a simple yet devastatingly effective instrument. Imagine a cross mounted on a pole with plumb lines hanging from each of its four arms. By sighting along opposing lines, the agrimensor could project perfectly perpendicular lines across any landscape, no matter how rugged or resistant. This was the engine of a system called centuriation. Conquered territory was transformed into a vast, uniform grid of square plots, each typically measuring 720 Roman paces on a side. These were not farm boundaries, they were the coordinates of control. This geometric net was cast across continents, from the plains of North Africa to the valleys of Gaul, creating a standardized template for 1,000 disparate cultures. The mindset here was not priestly but profoundly administrative. Every one of those perfect squares was a unit of taxation, a parcel for a retired legionary to colonize, a predictable block for military logistics. The agrimensors recorded it all on detailed bronze maps, turning living, breathing landscapes into entries in a ledger. This was surveying as the literal groundwork of bureaucracy, where geometry became law. The straight Roman road is the ultimate symbol of this philosophy. It did not gently follow the contours of the land. It sliced through them, marching over hills, across marshes, and through forests in a relentless, direct line. This defiance of topography was a statement of power. Nature's curves were an inconvenience to be engineered away. A winding path belonged to a local tribe. A straight road belonged to Rome, and it served one purpose: to move troops, officials, and trade with maximum speed from the center of power to its farthest edge. The grid and the road were two parts of the same system. The grid organized the land for production and taxation. The road siphoned that wealth back to the capital. Together, they formed the skeletal structure of the empire, a rigid anatomical frame upon which the muscle of the legions and the blood of commerce could flow. This practice was a force of cultural homogenization on a scale previously unimaginable. A farmer in Britain and a farmer in Syria might never meet, but they both plowed fields defined by the same geometric principle, paid taxes calculated by the same rectangular units, and lived in towns built around the same two crossing main streets, the Cardo and the Decumanus. Roman identity was not just taught, it was physically stamped into the earth they walked on. The surveyor's lines were a silent, daily lesson in what it meant to be part of the Roman world. They communicated order, hierarchy, and the inescapable presence of a distant authority. It proves a profound point that lines on a map could be as powerful as legions in holding an empire together. The agrimensor's groma was a weapon of consolidation, turning the chaos of conquest into a manageable, profitable, and enduring geographic fact. Yet, for all its oppressive efficiency, this Roman system contained a fascinating paradox, a hidden flexibility that might explain its astonishing longevity. Yet for all its rigid lines, the Roman grid held a hidden flexibility. The surveyors understood that the land was not a blank page, but a living surface with its own logic. Their manuals instructed them to respect existing sacred groves, to incorporate ancient pathways, and to adjust the grid around unyielding features like a hill or a marsh. This was not a contradiction, but a deeper wisdom. The perfect geometry was an ideal template, but its application required negotiation. The agrimensor had to be both a rigid enforcer of imperial order and a subtle diplomat with the terrain itself. This pragmatic compromise reveals a crucial truth about these ancient minds. Their greatest skill was not just imposing an idea, but adapting it, proving that true mastery lay in knowing when the straight line must yield to the curve. And this mastery was rooted in something far more fundamental than philosophy or politics. It was rooted in numbers. Behind every sacred alignment and every imperial road lay a quiet, relentless mathematical intellect. The Egyptian surveyor preparing the foundation of a pyramid faced the most critical moment of the entire project. A single crooked corner would multiply into a catastrophic error, dooming the structure to instability. His solution was breathtakingly simple and perfectly reliable. He would take a long rope, knotting it into 12 equal segments. By having assistants hold the knots at the 3rd, 7th, and 12th positions, and pulling the rope taut, he formed a triangle with sides of 3, 4, and 5 units. The angle opposite the 5-unit side was, and always will be, a perfect right angle. This was the practical application of a principle we know as the Pythagorean theorem, centuries before Pythagoras was born. It was not abstract geometry for its own sake. It was a tool born from the urgent necessity of laying a square base for a monument meant to last for eternity. The surveyor was the applied mathematician, turning a numerical relationship into physical truth on a colossal scale. This mathematical thinking reached for concepts we consider highly advanced. The dimensions of the Great Pyramid suggest its builders worked with a surprisingly accurate approximation of pi, the irrational number representing the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. If you take the pyramid's perimeter and divide it by twice its height, the result is remarkably close to pi. Whether this was intentional or a byproduct of another design choice remains debated, but it highlights the sophisticated numerical reasoning at play. They were operating with a level of precision that required a deep, intuitive grasp of proportion and ratio. Similarly, Babylonian clay tablets reveal surveyors using a base 60 mathematical system to calculate land areas, divide inheritances, and even compute compound interest. Their work demanded solutions to quadratic equations and an understanding of what we now call Pythagorean triples, all recorded in cuneiform as matters of routine administration. For them, mathematics was the language of fairness, of dividing a field among sons or assessing the grain tax from an irregular plot. Every time a surveyor stretched a knotted rope or marked a shadow's length, he was participating in a grand collective experiment. He was pushing the boundaries of what numbers could describe. The need to predict the Nile's flood led to the development of calendars and astronomy. The need to rebuild field boundaries after that flood refined geometry. The need to construct a vaulted roof or a soaring arch demanded new understandings of load and stress, encoded in proportional rules of thumb passed down through guilds. This was mathematics in its purest, most vital form. It was not a separate discipline studied in isolation. It was the invisible scaffold holding up their entire world, the silent partner to every act of creation. The surveyor did not see himself as a mathematician. He saw himself as a problem solver, but in solving the practical problems of alignment, distribution, and stability, he and his counterparts across the ancient world were slowly, painstakingly, inventing the very language of mathematics itself. Their lines on the earth were the first equations, their monuments the proof of concepts not yet written down. And if their calculations could shape stone and soil with such enduring accuracy, it forces us to wonder what other forms of knowledge, what other systems of meaning were woven into the very fabric of their measurements. But the straight lines and right angles of the surveyor's world were often drawn through a haze of profound uncertainty. Beyond the mathematics of water and stone lay a psychological landscape, one shaped by fear of the unknown and a desperate need to secure favor from invisible powers. For many ancient cultures, the ground itself was alive with spirits, and the sky was a parchment of divine messages. The surveyor, therefore, had to be more than an engineer. He had to become a reader of omens, a negotiator with the metaphysical. Before a single foundation stone could be laid in a new Roman colony, a priest known as an augur would perform a sacred ritual. He would mark out a square of sky with his staff and then watch, with intense concentration, for the flight patterns of birds within that celestial frame. The direction of their movement, their species, even their calls were interpreted as divine approval or veto for the proposed site and orientation. This was not a mere formality, it was the essential first step of the survey. A bad omen could halt an entire imperial project, forcing the agrimensors to pack up their gromers and look elsewhere. The technical blueprint was entirely subject to this spiritual verdict. Similarly, in ancient Mesopotamia, the hepatoscopy ritual involved examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The organ's lobes, markings, and texture were believed to be a direct map from the gods, revealing the future fortunes of a king's campaign or the suitability of a temple's foundation. The surveyor worked in the shadow of these readings. His precise measurements had to align not only with the cardinal directions, but also with a more cryptic celestial and terrestrial will. In China, the principles of Feng Shui formalized this negotiation with the unseen into a complete system. The Feng Shui master, acting as the lead surveyor, was diagnosing the flow of Kai, the vital life force, through a landscape. A site might be technically perfect with good drainage and a defendable position, but if it lay in the path of a poison arrow, a straight, rushing stream, or a sharply pointed hill, it was considered spiritually uninhabitable. The energy was too harsh, too direct, and would bring conflict and hardship. His solution was not to abandon the location, but to reshape it. He might plant a grove of trees to soften the sharp line, curve a pathway to slow the kai, or position a building at an angle that harmonized with the surrounding hills. His adjustments were a form of spiritual diplomacy, altering the physical plan to achieve metaphysical balance. This psychological layer created a constant, delicate tension for the master builder. He had to hold two sets of rules in his mind simultaneously. One was the immutable law of geometry and load-bearing physics. The other was the fluid, interpreted law of divine favor and energetic harmony. Sometimes these aligned beautifully, as when a sacred star rose directly over a strategically defensible hill, but often they conflicted. A spirit might be believed to dwell in a particular grove of ancient trees, a grove that sat precisely where the most efficient main avenue was supposed to run. The king demanded a straight road for his chariots, but the priests warned of calamity if the spirit was displaced. The surveyor was the one caught in the middle, tasked with finding a compromise. Perhaps he would curve the road gently around the grove, adding distance and cost but preserving the peace. Or he might design a small shrine within the grove, integrating the spirit into the new city's spiritual map. His work became a fusion of science and what we might call superstition, though for him, it was all part of a single, interconnected reality. This reveals a profound aspect of their mindset. Accuracy was not merely a technical standard, it was a holistic one. A perfectly measured temple that angered the local deities was, by their definition, a catastrophic failure. The surveyor's ultimate responsibility was to create a space that felt safe, prosperous, and right, not just on the drafting floor, but in the hearts and beliefs of the people who would live there. He was building a psychological sanctuary as much as a physical one, ensuring that the community could walk its streets without a lurking sense of dread, believing their homes were nestled within a benevolent order. This delicate dance between the measurable and the mystical asks us to reconsider the very purpose of their lines. Were they just marking property, or were they drawing boundaries against chaos itself? A straight line could determine a farmer's entire livelihood. Beyond cosmic harmony and imperial control, the surveyor's most relentless task was brutally practical. He measured wealth. His tools were the instruments of an ancient accountant, translating acres of grain and miles of riverfront into numbers on a tax ledger. This economic imperative turned geometry into a direct driver of state power and survival. In Egypt, the annual miracle of the Nile's flood was also an annual administrative crisis. As the waters receded, they left behind a world remade, a blank slate of rich, dark silt where every field boundary had been erased. Into this mud stepped the harpadonapti, the rope stretchers. These state surveyors, with their knotted cords, performed a ritual as vital as any religious ceremony. They restored the invisible lines that defined who owned what, preventing endless disputes and chaos. But their work did not stop at simple markers. Using geometry, they calculated the area of each irregular plot along the curving riverbank. This measurement was not academic. It directly converted into a grain tax obligation for the pharaoh's granaries. A slight error in their triangles could mean a family was taxed for land they did not have, or worse, that the state failed to collect the resources needed to feed the army and the cities during lean years. The surveyor's rope was quite literally a lifeline for civilization, his precision a matter of macroeconomic stability. This need for fair and efficient taxation fueled a quiet revolution in standardization. If every surveyor in the kingdom used ropes knotted to the same unit, the cubit, then records from Upper and Lower Egypt could be compared and compiled. The state could plan, it could budget, It could project the yield of an entire province from a sample of measured fields. The surveyor, in this light, was the original data scientist, collecting the metrics that allowed a complex society to function. We see a similar drive for economic efficiency in the astonishing uniformity of the Indus Valley cities like Mohenjo-Daro. Their streets were laid out in a precise grid with standardized widths. Even more telling, the bricks themselves were manufactured to a consistent ratio, one ideal for strong, load-bearing walls. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was logistical genius. Standard brick sizes meant construction could be planned from a distance, materials could be mass-produced, and any bricklayer could work on any building. The wide, straight streets allowed for the easy movement of carts laden with grain, pottery, and textiles to and from central warehouses. The entire city plan feels like the blueprint for a massive, integrated marketplace and distribution center. The surveyors who laid it out were thinking in terms of throughput, of minimizing friction in commerce, of creating a machine for living and trading. Their map was a fiscal circuit diagram. Across the ancient world, this pattern repeats. The Roman agrimenser's grid made taxable land units legible to a bureaucrat in Rome. The Mesopotamian surveyor's calculations of field area determined a farmer's share of the communal canal water and his debt to the temple. In China, detailed land registers, based on precise surveys, were the foundation of the imperial tax system for dynasties. The economic engine required measurement, and measurement required the surveyor. His work moved the harvest from the realm of nature into the realm of numbers, transforming the chaotic bounty of the earth into something that could be counted, taxed, traded, and managed. This relentless, pragmatic demand for quantification is what relentlessly refined their tools and methods. The need to be fair, or at least consistent, pushed them toward ever greater accuracy. It was a powerful feedback loop, where the state's hunger for resources funded the very science of measurement that would, centuries later, be used to map continents and navigate oceans. The lines they drew in the soil were, in the end, the earliest lines of a balance sheet. The words we use to describe our world still bear the fingerprints of those ancient measurers. Our language is a living archive of their craft, a testament to how deeply their work shaped not just landscapes but thought itself. Take the very word geometry. It comes from the Greek for earth measurement. This was not a theoretical exercise. It was the literal, hands-on practice of the surveyor, measuring fields and plotting boundaries. The abstract science we study in classrooms began as mud on a rope, a response to the urgent need to divide land fairly after a flood. Similarly, when we speak of getting our bearings or finding our orientation, we are invoking a world where the primary direction was east, from the Latin oriens, the rising sun. For the Roman planner or the Egyptian priest, establishing that eastern line was the sacred first act, the anchor from which all other order flowed. Our modern sense of direction is a direct inheritance from their cosmic alignment. Even our units of measurement tell a story. The stadium, a unit of length used across the ancient Mediterranean, derives from the Greek stadion, the standard length of a running track. This was a publicly known, standardized distance, perfect for surveyors who needed a common reference. The mile comes from the Roman mil passus, 1,000 paces of a legionary. These were not arbitrary numbers. They were born from the human scale and the practical rhythm of movement, formalized by the state for the precise purpose of measuring roads and territories. The surveyor's need for consistency literally gave the world a common ruler. Some terms carry a darker, more visceral echo of the order they imposed. The word decimate originates from a specific Roman military punishment, decimatio. In the face of cowardice or mutiny, legionaries would be forced to draw lots. Every 10th man selected by this grim, precise count would face a severe penalty. This practice was a brutal arithmetic of discipline, a reminder that the empire's power was built on an unyielding grid of numbers and consequences. It required the same mindset of precise counting and systematic selection that the agrimensor used to plot a grid of farmland. Order in this context was not just about harmony, it was about control enforced through mathematical certainty. These linguistic fossils reveal a profound truth. The concepts of measurement, boundary, alignment, and proportion were so fundamental to these ancient societies that they seeped into the very structure of communication. They moved from the specialized jargon of the rope stretcher and the augur into the common vocabulary of law, philosophy, and daily life. To delineate a plan, to circumscribe a problem, to have a parameter, these are all conceptual tools forged in the field. The surveyor's work provided a framework for abstract thinking. Once you can measure a field, you can begin to measure justice. Once you can plot a straight line to the horizon, you can conceive of a straight path to a moral ideal. Their practical struggle with distance and direction taught humanity how to think in terms of systems, ratios, and spatial relationships, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution millennia later. So when we use these words today, we are, in a small way, channeling the mind of the ancient surveyor. We are thinking with the categories they invented. This invisible legacy is perhaps their most enduring creation. They gave us more than pyramids and roads. They gave us a language to describe space, order, and our place within it. And if their influence is so deeply woven into our speech, it begs a final, humbling question. What other invisible structures from their world, what other silent frameworks of thought, do we still inhabit without even knowing? That language of measurement, however, was a flame that could be easily extinguished. The sophisticated ideas of the ancient surveyor did not travel on their own. They moved with people along the fragile arteries of trade and conquest, and their survival was never guaranteed. The exchange was often slow and indirect. A Greek philosopher like Thales, who traveled to Egypt, might have observed the rope stretchers at work, absorbing their practical geometry and bringing those principles back to the Mediterranean world. There, the abstract mind of Greek philosophy married the applied knowledge of Egyptian technicians, giving birth to the formalized geometry of Euclid. This was not theft, but a slow cultural osmosis, where techniques honed for millennia on the Nile Delta were repurposed to solve problems in the rocky soil of Athens. The sprawling network of the Silk Road served a similar purpose for cartography and instrument design. A Chinese compass or astrolabe principle might travel west with a caravan, adapted by Persian astronomers and later refined by Arab scholars, each culture adding a layer of innovation before the knowledge passed further along the chain. These were the rare, precious moments of connection, where a spark of understanding leaped across a cultural divide and found new fuel. Yet for every connection there were devastating ruptures. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous symbol of this fragility. Within its halls, it is believed, were countless treatises on engineering, hydraulics, and astronomy, the compiled technical wisdom of the ancient Mediterranean world. Its loss was not merely the destruction of scrolls, it was the silencing of 1,000 voices, the erasure of hard-won formulas and refined methods that had to be painfully rediscovered centuries later. Similarly, the still undeciphered script of the Indus Valley civilization means we can only guess at the precise mathematical rules their surveyors used to create those perfect, standardized cities. When that society faded, its technical knowledge faded with it, leaving behind only the mute, geometric testimony of its bricks and streets. Each collapse, whether from invasion, environmental shift, or social upheaval, represented a catastrophic reset button for the science of measurement. Guilds were scattered, masters perished without apprentices, and the living library of memory was burned to the ground. This reality forces us to see their progress not as a straight, ascending line on a graph, but as a flickering flame in a vast, windy darkness. A technique perfected in Mesopotamia might vanish for 1,000 years, only to be independently reinvented in China or Mesoamerica. The Roman aqueduct building genius flickered out in Europe during the early Middle Ages, its principles lying dormant until the Renaissance, when scholars desperately tried to reverse engineer the crumbling ruins. The flame was passed carefully from one hand to the next, but so many hands were cut down by war, famine, or simply the slow forgetting that comes with time. This fragility makes their surviving achievements all the more astonishing. They are not the inevitable products of progress. They are miracles of preservation, the work of generations who managed to shield a precious body of knowledge long enough to inscribe it permanently into the very bones of the earth. The pyramids, the roads, the city grids, these are more than monuments. They are the backup hard drives of a lost world, holding data that the written record failed to keep safe. And so we are left with a haunting legacy, a puzzle where the answers are written in alignments we can measure but whose full meaning we may never truly recover. The final lines of a surveyor's plan could be as much about feeling as they were about fact. A straight road might move an army, but a perfectly proportioned avenue could move the human heart. This reveals a dimension of their work often overshadowed by engineering and astronomy. The surveyor as an artist of space, a composer of visual harmony. Their measurements were not only about accuracy, but about achieving a specific emotional resonance, a beauty that felt as inevitable and right as the turning of the seasons. This pursuit often crystallized around a single, powerful mathematical idea, the golden ratio, often represented by the Greek letter phi. This ratio, approximately 1.618 to 1, appears repeatedly in nature, from the spiral of a nautilus shell to the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. Ancient thinkers believed it represented a divine proportion, the visual signature of a harmonious universe. The master builders of the Parthenon in Athens seem to have woven this ratio into the very fabric of the temple. The relationship between its length and width, the height of its facade to its width, even the spacing of its columns, all approximate phi. This was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate choice to make the structure feel inherently balanced and pleasing to the eye, a stone hymn written in the language of perfect proportion. Across the world, in the vast temple complexes of India, a similar philosophy governed design through the ancient texts of Vastu Shastra. Here, the entire layout, from the grandest tower to the smallest shrine room, was determined by a grid called the Vastu Purusha Mandala. This grid was not just a practical guide, it was a cosmic diagram representing the universe, with specific proportions assigned to different deities and purposes. The resulting harmony was believed to channel spiritual energy, making the temple not just a building to look at, but a vessel to experience. The surveyor translating this sacred geometry onto the ground was in effect tuning an instrument meant to resonate with both the gods and the human soul. This artistry extended into the very experience of moving through a space. Consider the approach to a great Egyptian temple like Karnak. The surveyor and architect collaborated to design a processional way lined with rows of sphinxes, leading the visitor through a series of towering gateways or pylons. Each pylon was higher than the last, while the floor gently inclined. This carefully measured progression created a powerful psychological effect. As you walked, the outside world gradually fell away. Your field of vision was framed and directed, the path narrowing, the scale growing more immense, building a sense of anticipation and humility until you finally stood in the shadow of the innermost sanctuary. This was architecture as a guided journey, a spatial narrative where every step was calculated for maximum awe. Even the finest details were subject to this artistic correction. The columns of the Parthenon are not perfectly straight. They have a slight outward bulge called intosses and lean subtly inward. The temple's platform curves imperceptibly upward at the center. Why would builders who could achieve such precision intentionally introduce these curves? because they understood that perfectly straight lines can sometimes appear to sag or distort to the human eye. These calculated imperfections were, in fact, hypercorrections. They made the temple appear more solid, more majestic, and more perfectly upright from a distance. The surveyor's stake and line were used to plot these subtle curves, proving their toolkit included an intimate knowledge of optical illusion and human perception. In the end, this artistic impulse completes our picture of the ancient surveyor's mind. He was a priest aligning with the cosmos, an engineer managing water and load, a bureaucrat mapping wealth, and finally, an artist orchestrating emotion. His lines sought to do more than just define a boundary or support a wall. They sought to lift the spirit, to instill reverence, and to create spaces that felt inherently true on a level that bypassed logic and spoke directly to the senses. He knew that for a city or a temple to truly live in the hearts of its people, it had to be more than functional. It had to be beautiful. This silent collaboration between measurement and meaning asks us to look at the empty spaces between ruins not as mere gaps, but as the echoes of a once powerful feeling. The surveyor's compass could point not only to the stars, but also to the whispering logic of the land itself. For every ruler who demanded a straight line, there was a mountain, a river, or a desert wind that offered a different, older wisdom. The true master understood that the most brilliant plan was one that listened. High on the sun-baked cliffs of the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, often called the Anasazi, did not fight the landscape. They learned its secret language. Their dwellings were not imposed upon the canyon walls, but woven into them. They sought out massive, south-facing alcoves under towering sandstone overhangs. This was not random. The overhang provided a natural roof, sheltering them from rain and snow. The south-facing orientation captured the low-angled winter sun, warming the stone floors, while the deep recess shaded them from the scorching high summer sun. The cliff itself became a giant thermal mass, regulating temperature with a passive efficiency any modern architect would envy. Their survey was one of perception, finding the precise niche where nature had already done most of the work, turning a geological formation into a fortress of comfort and security. Far to the south, in the vertiginous Andes, the Inca surveyors faced a different environmental puzzle. How do you feed a mountain empire without washing the precious soil down the slopes? Their answer was a breathtaking act of collaboration with the terrain, the terraced field. These were not just steps cut into a hill. They were a sophisticated hydrological and agricultural system. The surveyors first read the mountain's anatomy, its natural drainage patterns and soil stability. Each terrace wall, built with precisely fitted stone, acted as a giant retaining structure, halting erosion. But the design went deeper. They incorporated subtle gradients and drainage channels within the terraces to manage water flow from the frequent rains, preventing saturation and collapse. The terraces created microclimates, with different crops planted at different elevations to match temperature and sun exposure. The surveyor here was an ecological engineer, his lines following the mountain's contours not out of weakness, but out of profound respect. He was not conquering the slope, he was having a conversation with it, and the terraces were the lasting record of that dialogue. This represents a fundamental mindset shift from domination to symbiosis. In these practices, the surveyor had to be an ecologist long before the word existed. He needed to understand an entire watershed to know where to place a village so it had water but was safe from floods. He had to chart the path of the sun through the seasons to position windows for light and warmth, or to shade communal spaces. He had to know the prevailing wind patterns to ventilate homes or to position smoke outlets. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was born from generations of patient, localized observation, a deep memory of what worked and what brought hardship. A settlement built in harmony with these forces was sustainable. It could last for centuries because it was not fighting its environment. It was integrated into its cycles. This environmental wisdom fundamentally challenges a persistent modern myth that ancient planning was always about brute force alteration, about man triumphing over nature. While the Roman road and the pyramid are testaments to formidable will, the cliff dwelling and the terrace speak of a different kind of intelligence, one of adaptation and subtle guidance. It reveals a surveyor who saw the land not as a blank canvas, but as a living partner with its own set of instructions. The most enduring marks they left were often the ones that looked most natural, the ones that made it seem as if the village had always been there, growing from the stone and soil itself. This silent partnership between human intention and environmental logic may hold the most urgent lesson for us today, a reminder that the longest-lasting lines are those drawn with a listening hand. Stonehenge stands silent on the plain, a question carved in rock. Across Europe, from the standing stones of Karnak to the lonely circles of the Orkney Islands, we find landscapes deliberately marked by societies without kings, without cities, and without any system of writing. These are not the monuments of pharaohs or emperors. They are the collective signature of communities whose names are lost to time, yet whose ambition to measure the cosmos rivals any state-sponsored project. How did they do it? Without a bureaucratic machine to command labor or record plans, these societies achieved alignments of staggering precision, tracking the sun's furthest wanderings and the moon's most subtle pauses. The answer forces us to rethink where the drive to survey truly begins. It may not require a palace. It can spring from a shared ritual need so powerful it coordinates generations. Consider the long, eerie rows of the Karnak stones in Brittany, France. Nearly 3,000 individual megaliths stretch for miles across the countryside, arranged in parallel lines. From the ground, the pattern seems chaotic, a forest of weathered stone, but from above, a deliberate geometry emerges. Many of these rows are oriented to the rising sun on the solstices, those turning points of the year. To achieve this, the builders had to establish a baseline across undulating terrain, sighting on a distant horizon notch where the sun would peek through on a specific morning. They then had to place each multi-ton stone along that invisible line, maintaining the alignment over kilometers. This was a communal act of memory and coordination, repeated season after season, lifetime after lifetime. There was no central archive for the blueprint, no royal decree enforcing the design. The plan lived in the collective practice of the community, passed down through oral tradition and ritual reenactment. The knowledge required was likely held by a specialized group, perhaps a priestly class or council of elders. These individuals became the living repositories of celestial patterns. They would have spent years observing the sky, memorizing the positions of key stars, the sun's changing path, and the moon's complex 18.6-year cycle. Their authority came not from military force, but from their perceived ability to interpret the divine schedule of the heavens, to predict the best times for planting, for gathering, for ceremony. When they directed the community to haul a new stone to a specific spot, it was an act of faith. The labor was an offering, a participation in maintaining the cosmic order that sustained them all. This presents a unique social puzzle. How do you motivate hundreds of people to move massive stones, not for a king's tomb, but for an alignment only a few might fully understand? The answer lies in a shared belief system so potent that the act of building became the ritual itself. The process of surveying and placing the stones was the community's dialogue with the gods, a tangible expression of their place in a living universe. The scale of these projects over generations implies a different social contract. In state-driven societies, the surveyor's line is an extension of authority, a command from the top. At places like Stonehenge, the line seems to have been an expression of consensus, a collective agreement on a sacred geometry that bound the community together. The labor was likely seasonal, organized around festivals and celestial events. The same hands that planted the crops in alignment with the sun's warmth might later hold the sarsen stones to honor that same celestial power. This was surveying woven into the fabric of cultural life, not imposed upon it. The absence of written records is telling. The knowledge was too vital, too sacred, to be entrusted to passive marks on a surface. It had to be performed, remembered, and physically renewed with each generation that added to the circle or extended the row. The monument itself became the permanent record, a library in stone that could be read by those taught its language. This expands our view of the ancient surveyor's mind dramatically. It shows us that the impulse to measure and align the world is not a symptom of complex hierarchy. It can emerge from the heart of a community, driven by a shared desire to make meaning of the cycles of life, death, and renewal. The megalithic surveyor was likely both a scientist and a storyteller, translating the silent motion of the stars into a narrative of stone that the entire community could gather within and around. Their work created a sacred geography, turning the wild landscape into a known, ordered, and ritually charged space. This independent, belief-driven origin for large-scale surveying suggests the practice is far more fundamental to the human experience than we might assume. It is not merely a tool for building empires. It is, first and foremost, a tool for building a shared understanding of our place under the sky. And if communities without states could map the heavens with stones, what does that tell us about the very origins of the desire to measure our world? The pressure on the surveyor was absolute, for his lines held the weight of survival itself. A single misjudgment in the gradient of a Mesopotamian canal was not a mere engineering footnote. If the slope was too steep, water would rush through, eroding the precious clay banks and carving destructive gullies across the farmland. If it was too shallow, the life-giving flow would stall, allowing silt to settle and choke the channel until it became a stagnant, useless ditch. Either outcome spelled the same end, a failed harvest. In a society living on the razor's edge of aridity, that meant hunger, social unrest, and the very real possibility of a city being abandoned. The surveyor's calculations were a buffer against chaos, and his error margin was measured in empty granaries and silent streets. Beyond the practical, the spiritual consequences could be even more severe. A temple foundation laid a few degrees off from its intended celestial alignment was not simply crooked. In the eyes of the community and the priesthood, it was a dangerous rupture. It meant the house of the god was no longer properly connected to the cosmic order. Such a flaw could be interpreted as a dire omen, a sign of divine displeasure that might bring misfortune upon an entire reign. The pharaoh or king who commissioned it could see his legitimacy erode, as whispers spread that his rule was out of harmony with the heavens. The surveyor, therefore, carried a dual burden. His work had to satisfy both the immutable laws of physics and the perceived laws of cosmic harmony. A mistake was not just a professional failure, it was a theological and political catastrophe. This immense pressure forged a culture of extreme caution and redundancy. Rituals were not mere ceremony, they were checkpoints. The Babylonian practice of reading sheep livers before breaking ground, or the Roman augur taking the auspices, served as spiritual quality control, a chance for the gods to veto a flawed plan before it was too late. On the practical side, methods were designed with built-in verification. The Egyptian rope stretchers likely measured key distances multiple times from different baselines. The placement of a cornerstone would be confirmed by multiple astronomical sightings over several nights. This layered approach, blending ritual repetition with geometric cross-checking, was their version of a fail-safe system. It acknowledged human fallibility and sought to trap errors before they became permanent features in stone. This is why the occasional imperfections we find are so illuminating. They are not signs of incompetence, but windows into the problem-solving mind of the planner under real-world constraints. Look closely at the base of the Great Pyramid. Its sides are not perfectly straight lines, they have a very subtle concave indentation. This tiny deviation, less than a meter over the entire massive length, was discovered only with modern instruments. One compelling theory suggests it is not an error at all, but a brilliant intentional correction. The builders may have designed this slight inward curve to compensate for the optical illusion that makes a long, straight line appear to sag in the middle. Or it could be a structural adaptation, allowing the immense stone blocks to settle more evenly under their own colossal weight, preventing the outer faces from bulging outward over centuries. This was not a mistake, it was a refinement, a testament to their deep understanding of materials, perception, and long-term stability. Elsewhere, we see clear evidence of mid-construction corrections. At the Temple of Karnak, archaeologists have found foundation trenches that were dug, then partially filled and redrawn a few degrees to the side. This tells a vivid story of a surveyor or priest who, perhaps after a new astronomical observation or a directive from higher authority, ordered a change. The workers had to adapt, shifting their entire frame of reference. The psychological toll of such a moment is palpable. Imagine the murmurs among the crew, the anxious glances toward the master planner. Yet they corrected course. These on-the-fly adjustments humanized these distant figures. They were not infallible gods of measurement. They were skilled professionals working with imperfect tools under the burning sun, answering to nervous patrons and racing against seasons and budgets. They dealt with unlevel bedrock, with sight lines obscured by dust, with ropes that stretched and stakes that shifted. Their genius lies not in achieving mythical perfection, but in navigating a minefield of potential errors to produce works of such resilience that they fool us into thinking their process was effortless. Every surviving straight line, every enduring alignment, is therefore a victory over 1,000 hidden pitfalls. It is the product of a mind that knew the terrible cost of a wrong angle, and who deployed every ounce of tradition, ingenuity, and painstaking care to ensure that his line would hold both for this world and the next. Their greatest monuments stand without a signature. We marvel at the pyramids, the aqueducts, the celestial cities, and we credit civilizations, pharaohs, emperors. But these works were not summoned into being by a collective will alone. They were directed by singular minds, individuals whose genius for seeing space and solving problems in entirely new ways changed everything. They were the Da Vincis of antiquity, the Michelangelos of measurement, and history has forgotten every single one of their names. Think of the anonymous master who first conceived of using water itself as a level. Before this, achieving a true horizontal over a long distance, like for a canal or a temple foundation, was a nightmare of guesswork and stacked blocks. Then, one day, a thinker observed the immutable fact that water always seeks its own level. He or she took a long, hollowed-out trough, filled it with water, and looked at the surface. That calm, flat plane became the universal reference. With this simple, profound tool, a surveyor could now transfer a level line across a valley, from one hilltop to another, with perfect accuracy. This was not a minor improvement. It was a conceptual revolution, turning an elemental truth into a foundational tool of engineering. We have no idea who first held that trough and saw the future in the water's stillness. Or consider the leap in celestial mapping. Tracking a star's path with fixed poles is one thing. But what about accounting for the slow, subtle wobble of the Earth's axis, a cycle taking 26,000 years? This shift, called precession, means the North Star changes over millennia. The star they called Theban, not Polaris, was the pole star when the Great Pyramid was built. To maintain precise alignments over centuries, some master astronomer surveyor must have noticed this glacial drift. He would have compared his own observations against the sacred records of his ancestors, seeing a tiny discrepancy in the rising points of key stars. He would have had to convince a skeptical priesthood that the eternal heavens were, in fact, slowly turning. Then he would have had to adjust the entire system of alignment, recalibrating the sacred geography of his kingdom. This individual saw a pattern invisible to anyone else, a shift measured in fractions of a degree over a human lifetime. His correction ensured that temples built generations later would still be in harmony with a changed sky. His insight was a triumph of long-term observation over dogma, and we do not know what he was called. We can sometimes see their personal touch in the archaeological record, in the elegant solutions to unique problems. Look at the cliffside city of Petra. To bring fresh water into that hidden, arid canyon, Nabatean engineers carved channels and built clay pipelines along sheer rock faces. The gradient had to be precise, a steady, gentle drop over miles to maintain flow without erosion. Somewhere, there was a lead surveyor who walked that brutal landscape, visualizing the entire system from spring to city center. He had to decide where to cut tunnels through solid rock, where to build delicate aqueducts across gaps, and how to hide the channels from enemies. His plan was a masterpiece of hidden hydraulics, a secret lifeline that made the desert bloom. The grandeur of Petra's tombs is what we photograph, but the true genius is in the forgotten watercourse, the work of a mind that could see rivers in the dry stone. These innovators worked within the constraints of their culture, using the materials and beliefs of their time, but they possessed a restless curiosity that pushed boundaries. A Mesopotamian scribe, tired of clumsy area calculations for odd-shaped fields, might have doodled in the clay and discovered a more elegant geometric proof. A Roman agrimentor, frustrated by the gromer's limitations in high wind, might have refined its design or invented a more stable sighting instrument. Their breakthroughs spread because they worked, because they solved real and urgent problems, becoming the new standard practice taught to the next generation of apprentices. The tool itself becomes their nameless memorial. This is the most intimate tragedy of ancient technology. We can trace the evolution of the plumb bob, the advancement of the sundial, the refinement of the astrolabe, but the moments of individual inspiration, the flash of insight that preceded each improvement, are lost in silence. These men and women were not just technicians executing a formula. They were artists of the practical, philosophers with ropes and rods. They looked at a challenge, a mountain to be terraced, a river to be tamed, a star to be pinned down, and they saw a solution no one had seen before. Their legacy is not in a name on a plaque, but in the enduring straightness of a road, the perfect flow of an aqueduct, and the silent, steadfast alignment of a temple that still greets the sun on the appointed day. They shaped the physical world we have inherited, and in doing so, they shaped the very possibilities of human society, all from the shadows of history. This divergence in thinking reveals itself in the very shape of their lines on the earth. A Roman legionary marching down the Via Appia walked a path of uncompromising intent. The road beneath his sandals was a declaration. It spoke of a universe where human reason could and should impose its logic upon the wild, untamed world. The ideal was the straight line, the perfect right angle, the grid that organized chaos into manageable, taxable squares. This philosophy viewed nature as a material to be mastered, a force to be channeled and controlled by the superior order of human intellect and imperial will. The aqueduct did not follow the land's curve. It pierced through mountains and spanned valleys to deliver water on a schedule. The city grid ignored the old, meandering goat paths, replacing them with a predictable, rational lattice. This was surveying as an act of confident assertion, a belief that the pure forms of geometry, the line, the square, the circle, represented a higher truth that the messy reality of the landscape needed to conform to. It was a worldview that placed humanity, and particularly the organized state, at the apex of a hierarchy, with the divine gift of reason granting dominion. Contrast this with the journey of a feng shui master in ancient China, walking a hillside where a new home was to be built. His gaze was not fixed on a distant, geometric point. It was soft, absorbing. He felt the breeze, listened to the water in a nearby stream, noted the shape of the surrounding mountains. He was diagnosing the flow of Kai, the vital breath of the earth itself. His goal was not to impose a foreign shape, but to discover the most harmonious position for a human structure within this living, energetic landscape. A sharply pointed hill might send cutting negative energy, so the house would be set to one side or shielded by a grove of trees. A gently winding stream in front would pool nourishing Kai, while a straight, rushing channel would drain it away too quickly. Here, the ideal line was often the curve, the adaptation, the integration. The surveyor's role was to listen and adjust, to become a translator between the invisible currents of the natural world and the human need for shelter and community. This Eastern emphasis saw humanity not as a master, but as a participant within a vast, interconnected system. The Chinese compass, a brilliant invention, was not first created for navigation or warfare. It was a geomancer's tool, a luopan, its concentric rings marking constellations, landforms, and cyclical time, all used to align buildings and tombs with the favorable flow of earthly and heavenly forces. Only later was this technology adapted for maritime navigation, a practical application born from a spiritual science. This is not to say one approach was superior or that the philosophies never mixed. The Romans absolutely considered the auspices, the divine signs, before founding a city, and Chinese engineers built staggeringly precise, straight canals and massive walls when the need for hydraulic control or defense demanded it. The difference is one of foundational emphasis of first principles. Was the primary goal to manifest a rational ideal onto the world, or to integrate a human project into the world's existing spiritual and energetic fabric? Was the surveyor a conqueror with a measuring rod or a mediator with a compass? This philosophical fork in the road shaped everything. It influenced the tools they prioritized, the problems they deemed most critical, and even the emotional experience of the spaces they created. Walking a Roman city can feel like moving through a diagram of power, clear, legible, and commanding. Walking through a classical Chinese garden with its carefully composed views, its winding paths that hide and reveal, and its symbolic rock formations, is meant to feel like a journey through a miniature cosmos, inspiring contemplation and a sense of peaceful belonging. Both are masterpieces of intentional design, but they speak to different answers to the same eternal question. What is our true place in this vast, ordered, yet beautifully wild universe? Their surveying lines, therefore, were not just technical marks. They were philosophical statements etched permanently into the continents. And if their tools and thoughts could differ so profoundly, it makes you wonder what other silent conversations, what other debates about humanity's role, are still encoded in the forgotten corners of the maps they left behind. A laser can map a forgotten city in minutes, revealing grids and avenues swallowed by the jungle for 1,000 years. Modern tools like LiDAR and geographic information systems allow us to see what the ancient surveyor saw, the grand design laid over the land before a single stone was set. We can prove with mathematical certainty that a temple's axis points to a star's rising point, or that a network of roads converges on a sacred mountain with intentional precision. The data is undeniable, a ghostly blueprint resurrected from the earth, yet this technological triumph reveals a profound and enduring silence. The laser scans the stone, but it cannot scan the mind that placed it. It shows us the alignment, but not the anxiety, the ambition, or the awe that motivated it. We can prove a Mayan structure was built to track Venus. But was this to fulfill a specific king's astrological prophecy, a desperate attempt to secure victory in an upcoming war, Or was it a general priestly tradition, a calendar marker for agricultural cycles repeated for generations? The stone gives no answer. The artifact presents us with the what and the how, a magnificent frozen result. The why remains locked away, a private conversation between the planner and his gods lost to time. This gap is where true historical mystery not only survives but thrives. It forces us into a fascinating kind of detective work, one that lives at the intersection of laser precision and human intuition. We must take our hard data, our maps and statistical analyses, and bring them into conversation with anthropology, comparative religion, and even cognitive science. We look at how other cultures in similar environments solved similar problems. We study the cognitive patterns of human spatial reasoning, asking how a planner might have visualized a complex city from a single baseline. We build plausible models of their thought processes, not as definitive answers, but as educated conversations with the past. It is a reminder that understanding these individuals requires both the scientist's measuring tape and the storyteller's empathy. We are left to reconstruct the internal dialogue from the external marks, listening for the echo of a thought in the geometry of a ruin. That straight Roman road, that perfect Egyptian right angle, did not vanish when the empires fell. Instead, they dissolved into the groundwater of human thought, seeping into the foundations of how we see our world today. The most profound legacy of these ancient minds is not a specific monument, but an invisible framework, the very idea that space can be measured, defined, and rationally organized. Their work birthed the fundamental disciplines we now call cartography, civil engineering, and systematic land management. Look at any modern property deed. The lines on that legal document are the direct descendants of the Roman limites, the survey lines that once carved conquered territory into taxable squares. The meticulous record-keeping of Mesopotamian field allotments evolved into the cadastral maps that define nations. The ancient impulse to mark a boundary in the dirt is the same impulse that now requires a satellite to confirm a fence line. This is a continuity of intellect, not just of stone. The relentless quest for precision that began with shadow lengths and knotted ropes created a feedback loop of curiosity. To measure the land more accurately, they needed better astronomy. To build more stable structures, they refined geometry. This hunger for exactitude, nurtured for millennia in fields and temples, eventually blossomed into the scientific revolution. Thinkers like Galileo and Newton did not emerge from a vacuum. They inherited a world already deeply committed to the premise that the universe operated by mathematical laws, a premise proven daily by the surveyor's successful application of those laws to the Earth itself. Every time an ancient planner used the stars to find true north, he was participating in a grand experiment that would one day allow us to send probes beyond the solar system. The tool has transformed beyond recognition. The rope stretcher's cubit has been replaced by the laser's wavelength. The sighting pole aligned with a mountain notch has been supplanted by a constellation of satellites whispering precise coordinates to a handheld device. Today's surveyor, achieving millimeter accuracy with global positioning systems, is the direct professional descendant of the Harperdonapti on the Nile's floodplain. They share the same core mission to translate an abstract idea of location into an indisputable point on the ground. What has remained constant across 5,000 years is the mindset. It is the drive to quantify the world, to replace ambiguity with a number, to replace dispute with a measured fact. It is the confidence that space is not a chaotic mystery, but a realm that can be understood, divided, and shaped by human intention. This enduring line connects the architect of Teotihuacan, aligning his city to the Pleiades, to the urban planner designing a new subway line using digital terrain models. Both are answering the same fundamental human need, to impose order on our environment, to create a stage upon which community, commerce, and culture can securely unfold. Our modern world, with its interconnected grids of transportation, communication, and law, is built upon this ancient, silent consensus that the Earth can be mapped. We live inside the legacy of their thought every time we use a navigation app, every time we accept a property survey, every time we trust that a bridge's engineering will hold. The thread is unbroken. It stretches from the first stake driven into the soil to mark a sacred direction, to the satellite signal pinning your location on a digital globe, a continuous testament to the human desire to know precisely where we are. The surveyor's line could be a wall. While their measurements connected heaven and earth, they also drew boundaries that divided human from human, creating a geography of privilege and exclusion. This power to define space was inevitably a power to enforce social order, often etching inequality directly into the very soil people walked upon. Consider the classic layout of an ancient Mesoamerican city center like Tikal or Teotihuacan. At the heart stood the vast ceremonial plaza, flanked by towering pyramids and elite palaces built on high platforms. These sacred and administrative cores were often walled or separated by wide, empty spaces from the sprawling, densely packed residential districts where the common people lived. The surveyor who laid out this plan was not merely organizing functions. He was physically codifying a cosmic and social hierarchy. The elevated temples aligned with the gods were for the priestly class. The spacious palaces with their views of the sacred mountains were for the nobility. The crowded, low-lying neighborhoods, often with poorer drainage and farther from the central water sources, were for everyone else. The city plan was a three-dimensional map of status, where your place in society was mirrored by your literal elevation and proximity to the axis of power. This spatial stratification was not an accident of urban growth. It was a deliberate design choice, executed with the same precision used to track Venus. The surveyor's tools ensured that the social distance between king and farmer was made permanent in stone and space. This dynamic became even more stark under colonial rule. When Spanish conquistadors laid out new cities in the Americas, they frequently employed a model called the Laws of the Indies. This planning guide mandated a central plaza surrounded by key institutions: the church, the governor's palace, the town hall. The lots closest to this plaza, the solares, were reserved for the Spanish elite and the church. Indigenous populations were often relocated to peripheral neighborhoods, called barrios or reductions, deliberately separated from the civic and religious heart of the community. The straight, wide streets radiating from the plaza facilitated military control and cultural oversight, while the physical distance enforced a social and racial hierarchy. The colonial grid was not just an efficient layout, it was an engine of segregation, using geometry to make dominance and difference a daily, visible reality. The surveyor implementing this plan, whether a European engineer or a local apprentice forced to adapt his skills, was the technician of this new order. His chain and compass translated a policy of conquest into an inescapable spatial fact, one that would shape social dynamics for centuries. Even in contexts without overt conquest, the allocation of land through surveying could cement deep inequalities. In ancient Egypt, the best, most reliably flooded land along the Nile was typically owned by the state, the temples, and the elite. When the royal surveyors restored boundaries after the annual flood, they were often reaffirming these entrenched holdings. A peasant family might work a small, marginal plot far from the river's main channel, their tenure precarious and their tax burden heavy. The surveyor's measurement, while technically accurate, served to formalize an unequal distribution of the kingdom's most vital resource. His work upheld an economic system where the fruits of the land flowed upward, supporting the monumental projects we admire today, while the majority lived with far less. This forces a difficult but necessary question about the ancient surveyor's role. Were they merely neutral technicians, applying their skills to the tasks set by their kings and priests? Or were they, by virtue of their unique craft, active agents in making social hierarchies permanent, literal, and unassailable? The answer likely lies in a nuanced middle ground. They operated within the worldview and directives of their time, rarely in a position to challenge the fundamental premises of their society. Their professional pride was in accuracy and execution, not in social critique. Yet, their technical skill is what gave those social structures their formidable durability. A crooked social order might be overturned, but a social order built into the right angles of city blocks, the orientations of temples, and the maps of land ownership is far harder to dismantle. It becomes part of the environment, accepted as simply the way things are. Reflecting on this dimension does not diminish their intellectual achievements. Instead, it completes the portrait, reminding us that the science of measurement is never truly neutral. It is always applied within a specific social, political, and economic context that gives it meaning and consequence. The surveyor's line could connect a community to the cosmos, but it could also fence one group away from another. This duality is part of their legacy, a sobering lesson in how the tools we create to understand our world can also be used to divide it. It asks us to look at the old plans and the ancient streets with clear eyes, seeing not only the genius of their alignment, but also the silent stories of access and exclusion they contain. And if their lines could so powerfully shape human relations, it makes us wonder what invisible boundaries our own systems of measurement are drawing today. Their lines were drawn for a horizon they would never reach. While we navigate quarterly reports and election cycles, the ancient surveyor planned in units of centuries, his work a silent contract with generations yet unborn. This long-term mindset is not a quaint historical footnote. It is perhaps their most urgent and overlooked lesson for our modern world. Consider the Qanat systems of ancient Persia, a marvel of sustainable engineering. These were not simple wells, they were gently sloping underground tunnels, sometimes stretching for 50 miles, painstakingly dug to tap into water trapped deep within mountain foothills. The construction of a single Qanat was a multi-generational project, demanding decades of labor and precise surveying to maintain the exact gradient needed for water to flow without eroding the tunnel walls. A master surveyor would begin the work knowing he might not live to see the first drop of water emerge at the distant outlet. He dug for his grandchildren's grandchildren, trusting that his measurements would hold long after his name was forgotten. This was planning on a geological timescale, an investment in permanence that turned arid deserts into blooming orchards for thousands of years. The Qanat did not just deliver water, it managed the entire resource with profound wisdom. Because it was underground, it minimized evaporation under the blistering sun. Because it used gravity, it required no external power. And because its communal ownership was tied to its construction and maintenance, it fostered a culture of shared responsibility. The surveyor here was not just plotting a tunnel, he was laying the groundwork for a social and ecological system designed to endure. This philosophy of deep time echoes in their celestial alignments. When a Mayan astronomer priest calculated the complex 584-day cycle of Venus, he was not planning for next year's harvest. He was creating a calendar that would remain accurate for centuries, a tool for ritual and rule that would outlive dynasties. His work assumed the continuity of civilization, that there would always be someone to watch the sky and read the stones. This intergenerational confidence stands in stark contrast to the short-termism that often drives our own infrastructure and policy. We patch roads, we debate temporary solutions, we plan for the next decade, not the next millennium. The ancient surveyor, by contrast, built anchors. He thought in terms of legacies, not launches. His most profound projects were acts of faith, a belief that the future was worth a tremendous present sacrifice. The terraces of the Andes, the flood management of the Nile, the sacred geometry of a temple, all required a society willing to defer gratification, to invest labor and resources into a vision whose full fruition they would never witness. This required a different kind of courage, one rooted not in immediate reward, but in reverence for the chain of human continuity. They saw themselves as links in that chain, responsible for receiving a world measured and ordered by their ancestors, and obligated to pass on a better, more harmonious one to those who would follow. Their monuments are the physical manifestation of this covenant across time. In an era defined by climate change and rapid urbanization, their example is a powerful corrective. The challenges we face, sea level rise, resource depletion, sustainable city design, demand exactly this kind of long arc thinking. They require us to plan for climate patterns that shift over centuries, to build coastal defenses that will protect cities 100 years from now, to design urban grids that can adapt to changes we can only dimly foresee. The Ancient Surveyor teaches us that such planning is not impossible. It has been done before. It requires shifting our perspective from the immediate to the enduring, from the individual lifespan to the lifespan of a culture. It asks us to make decisions that may be unpopular today because they will make a thriving world possible tomorrow. Their silent, steadfast lines on the land are a message in a bottle from the past, reminding us that the most meaningful marks we can make are those meant to be read by futures we can only imagine. Our journey inside these minds reveals a portrait far richer than any single title could hold. They were not mere technicians with ropes and rods. They were astronomers who read the sky as a sacred text, priests who negotiated with the divine, artists who composed in stone and shadow, economists who quantified the wealth of nations, and ecologists who listened to the whispered logic of the land. Their true genius lay in operating at the thrilling intersection of the tangible and the transcendent. With one hand, they felt the gritty soil and the weight of a stone. With the other, they traced the paths of distant stars and mapped the currents of unseen energy. Their tools were humble, but their vision was cosmic, weaving the very fabric of civilization from these dual threads of earth and sky. This synthesis is their enduring gift. We still walk within the blueprint they drew. The property deed for your home descends from their boundary stones. The grid of your city echoes their first cardinal lines. The very urge to navigate, to map, to build something that lasts, is a whisper of their legacy in our collective mind. They transformed the chaos of the natural world into a stage for human story, proving that to shape a civilization is first to imagine its space. It begins not with a brick, but with a line. A line of thought, of observation, of intention made manifest upon the earth. So as you look at the world now, at the streets you travel and the horizons you gaze toward, try to see the invisible lines they drew. See the ancient geometry in the modern map, the celestial alignment in the urban plan, and then consider this: every generation stands as a surveyor for the next. We are all, in our own way, drawing lines that will shape the future. The question their legacy leaves us with is a profound one. What blueprints are we drawing today for the civilizations of tomorrow? What foundations are we laying with what care, and toward what distant star are we aligning our collective path? If this exploration of hidden history and silent architects resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the mysteries of the past. We would love to hear your thoughts as well. Which ancient surveying feat astounds you the most? Is it the precision of the pyramids, the ambition of the Roman roads, or the celestial wisdom of forgotten astronomies? Share your perspective in the comments below.